Thank you. So I think your program probably told you who the three of them are, but they really are three of the best editors in America. So I'm going to start out with a softball for them, and then we'll get harder. Give me a few seconds or a minute on a story you're really proud of, or a line of coverage you're really proud of, starting with Mark and Mindy and Norm.
I have to limit it to one.
Yes,
okay.
You have to do one.
They're all my babies. You know, we did I think a pretty remarkable enterprise project this year called The Children of Central City that answered a lot of the questions that our readers have had about our commitment to long-form, in-depth, investigative community journalism. Had two reporters literally move into Central City for 9 months, reported entirely on the story, trying to understand the impact of violence in one of New Orleans' most historic and culturally vibrant neighborhoods, and also one of the neighborhoods with the highest crime rate in New Orleans. And what we produced at the end of that 9 months was a package of stories that touched readers in multiple ways. We put out 3 extraordinary newspapers with a great print presentation. We had an 18-minute documentary video. We had a special interactive site that captured all of the stories in one sitting. We had a social media campaign, and I think it was just such a snapshot of what local journalism can be and needs to be if it's going to remain relevant and survive. It was immersive about an issue of importance. It was a story only we could tell, and we told it in a really dynamic way.
Mindy?
So it's been a fairly busy year in Florida, starting with the school shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in February, followed by a pedestrian bridge collapse in March, and then a couple of hurricanes for good measure, a recount, because in Florida, you know, the elections never end. And so, but if I had to really pick one thing that I'm really proud of, I would say that last week we published a project that was a result of a one-year investigation by one of our reporters, and it's called Perversion of Justice. And we revisited a 10-year-old case in which a multimillionaire who had been accused of sexually trafficking underage girls, we revealed something in the number of 80 of them, and the lenient sentence that he received in the deal that was crafted by then the Miami U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, who is now the Secretary of Labor. And when my reporter first pitched that story, I said, what do we really have to tell that's new, given how much attention this case has gotten over the years? And she said, we've never heard from the victims. Like, we've never heard their part of the story. And as it turns out, there's a lot new to mine there. We also were able to get a lot of new details about how that backroom deal came together that excluded the victims themselves. And we were able to get, for the first time, several of those victims who were, at the time, 14 and 15-year-olds, some of them still wearing braces, now women in their 20s and 30s, to actually tell their stories on the record and on camera. And I had read the various iterations of that story, and I knew that it was powerful, but I really was not expecting the kind of feedback that we've gotten, not just locally, but across the country. And I think that's to Mark's point. We went after the story when our local guy, Acosta, was nominated to be in President Trump's cabinet. And so that was a responsibility that we felt we had to look at one of our own, even though we had kind of been looking at the issue of the sexual trafficking of minors before that. But it's a great example of how a local story can become a national story. But really, I'm not sure anybody else would have gone back and looked at this case if we had not really spent the time. And so I'm really I'm really proud already. There's talk that even though he wasn't in serious consideration for to replace Jeff Sessions, but he's definitely not under consideration. There's some talk of wanting to reopen the investigation and look at the sweetheart deal. So I'm really proud of that work by our reporter.
Norm?
Well, up until the beginning of November, I thought that our best coverage of the year involved the University of Southern California, really building on coverage from the year before, and an expose of the university's gynecologist who had basically made improper advances towards scores of women, in fact, hundreds of them. But really, this last month, beginning with the midterms, and then a few days later, a shooting in Thousand Oaks where several people were killed, and then the wildfires across California all coming at once put an extraordinary strain on our metro desk. Many of the reporters who were involved in that actually lived in Thousand Oaks and were comforting friends and neighbors over the deaths of their children, only to have their houses evacuated a couple days later, and that they were able to continue reporting really across the state, not only the Woolsey fire in Southern California, but the Camp Fire in Paradise, I think was the standout piece of the year for us.
So now I'll ask a couple harder questions. The advertising for newspapers has pretty much been moved elsewhere. Print circulation, I saw a study that said the San Jose Mercury News has lost like 33% of its print circulation just in the last 18 months. I cannot imagine that most American newspapers will survive. It's hard to imagine that regional papers in particular that half of them will not exist in 5 years. Is that a fair calculation?
Well, I think if you frame it as, will newspapers survive?
Well,
Right?
I'm not talking about print, actually. I'm
Okay,
actually
so
talking
local-
about the local news organizations that are shifting from print to digital. I don't mean
Yeah.
print itself. I think everybody agrees that print is not going to survive the way, for a generation we were used to it. I mean those institutions.
Yeah, but in my mind, the survival of those institutions depends on their ability to think of themselves as something other than newspapers. And I think we're still fighting that battle. We've really got to reframe the narrative about journalism and what's happening to local journalism. It is not about the death of newspapers. It's about the reinvention of local journalism. And the transformation that has to occur inside of newsrooms will determine whether or not we survive as local news organizations that can hold our leaders accountable and capture and reflect our communities and their cultures and bring people together. But I think the solution to it is in the work that we produce and our willingness to reinvent ourselves, our willingness to not allow nostalgia and a memory of how things used to be done and how many people we used to have, but to really take advantage of the tools that are available to us now. I tell my staff all the time, this is the dark ages of the media business, but it's the golden age of journalism. We have the ability to tell stories in more ways, connect with readers more deeply, more quickly, more immediately, have impact not only locally but nationally with our work in a way that is exhilarating and kind of incomparable. And if we all embrace that in every market, in every small town, medium-sized town, and large city, then we're going to create something that will survive as a business because people will regard us as indispensable. And I think we're still having to make that cultural and mental shift as an industry.
I think that in some ways, I don't want to minimize the fact that we are going to meet newspapers in this country are facing a serious threat. But in some ways, I like to say that we're so good at telling our own stories, a little too good in this instance. So we ourselves write so much about the issues that newspapers face, but then somehow left out of the conversation is the fact that the same digital upheaval that is impacting us is impacting television and cable and the music industry. And so technology is disrupting everyone. And so the key is, how are we responding to that disruption? And again, it's not just us, it's everyone. And so it requires a creative realignment of how you approach what you do. I think the essence of what we do is so critical. I think we have to figure out how we keep doing what we do. I cannot imagine a city like Miami without the Miami Herald to hold our elected leaders and the powerful accountable. And I think what we are doing is that you see, as Mark said, trying so many things. While the subscriptions are going down, our digital, and I don't have to tell you, Dean, because I'm sure that both of you have incredible digital traffic, but that's what we've seen. So we're reaching more people actually today than we did in the heyday. More people are reading our content than ever. There's no geographic borders that limit who comes to us and who can access what we do. We're being very creative about, we not just creating and delivering news, but being conveners, which is something that we've always been great at doing. So that's like events like this that bring people together to have serious conversations about topics that are important to their communities, and to continue, even as we face shrinking resources, to continue to figure out how you focus on the things that are most important, the mission content that no one else can do. And so that's what we do, right? You don't need to come to the Miami Herald to read about politics, national politics, but you probably should come to the Miami Herald to read about Cuba or Colombia or Florida politics, because we're better at it than most everybody else. So I think that it's just, we are going to have to continue to push on how the multiple ways of trying to replace the revenue streams that we're losing from advertising, but subscriptions, events, the generosity of nonprofits. We were able to publish a really terrific and ambitious project on Puerto Rico, thanks to underwriting by the Rockefeller Foundation, for instance. So I think it's going to be a mix of solutions that's going to get us to the next step. But above all, it's going to be, we're going to have to convince our readers that they need to support what we do with their dollars and subscribe digitally.
I loved what y'all did in Perversion of Justice. As you're going through that incredible series of stories, every now and then you just get hit with a solicit that says support investigative journalism. And that's, I think we've got to have that conversation. You have to bring that conversation back to your cities. We've got a responsibility to remain relevant by being multi-platform, by reaching readers where readers are. But I think communities have a responsibility to support the work we do. Journalism is expensive. And if people are going to insist on getting the information for free, they're going to get a quality of information that is, that is not what they've been accustomed to getting. And one quick point, and I'll let you, jump in, Norm. I mean, I think that the Times-Picayune will always exist. I really do believe that. I think the Miami Herald will always exist, the LA Times. I think the question that is still an open question is, how large of a newsroom will the business support?
I think you're being wildly optimistic, actually. It is, you're right that it's never been a better time to be a journalist unless you want to get paid. And that the story to me is not about serving the public interest, but about whether you can build a viable business. And it's not just about what's going on in our communities. I was having breakfast with Julia Angwin this morning, and we were talking about the ways in which Google and Facebook have just sucked the revenues out of every news publication you can imagine, be it print, newspaper, or magazine. And I don't see that going away as long as the rules for copyright and so forth are as they are. It seems to me that no ad-supported media will be able to survive if that's the only part of its business model, and that all of the indications we see are that when you try to figure out what subscribers will pay for, it's not necessarily going to be great landmark journalism. What I think is going to be interesting to see is a very different model that's emerging, and we're one example of it in Los Angeles. Dean, your predecessor, John Carroll, gave a speech in Seattle in 2006, which was after he had left the Los Angeles Times because he thought it would become increasingly difficult to do great journalism. And a lot of his speech was about the role of for-profit companies that were buying into newspapers just to see how much cash they could pull out of them. But his final point was that the one hope for urban newspapers was that they return to local ownership, preferably by people who had enough resources and enough concern for that public interest that you talk about, that they would run these publications as a business, but not for return on investment. And I think you see some examples of that, and in other cases, people who have been able to stay the course in the face of the kind of pressure on profits that has been so much the flip, if you will, of what Google and Facebook have been doing. And so for every, digital first or gatehouse or any chain that is really owned but has to answer to shareholders, you see an example like the New York Times where the two classes of stock and family control just stood up to extraordinary pressure over a decade as you were able to invest going forward. Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post for a rounding error in his net worth, and then investing in it has made a very big difference. Yeah. And earlier this year, after more than a decade of really tough management from Chicago, the Los Angeles Times passed its ownership to Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, who has a number of other things going on as well, but who truly bought the publication because of an interest in public interest. And I think that absent that, it is going to be very tough to see the resources available. You take an example like McClatchy, where Craig Foreman, the CEO, comes out of journalism and really cares about editorial product and has supported investigative reporting such as you've done. But the kinds of layoffs that have gone on in McClatchy in the last 18 months are what happens when you have to answer to public shareholders. And I think that as long as that is part of the equation, and the other part of the equation is that programmatic is a better place for advertisers to put their dollars than behind news, it's hard to be optimistic.
Yeah. So let me. I agree with what. I agree with all of you, and I agree with what Mark said, that the names and some version of these news institutions will survive. But I think I've worked for two of the. I can't keep a job. I've worked for every newspaper in the country, I think, and I've worked for two of the papers here. None of us are the same size we were 10 years ago. So while it's true that there are tremendous we can do things we could never do. We could do video, we can do multimedia, but most newspapers, most news organizations are significantly smaller than they were. What are you not covering? The beauty of the traditional model that most of us grew up in, the beauty of it was you were rewarded for breadth of coverage. You were rewarded for covering 20 things, and maybe you only did. All of us only did 5 of them extremely well, and 15 of them, good enough. But what are you not covering? What are you not covering that you want to cover?
I think the question is not what are we not covering, because I couldn't list anything that we covered with 200 people in a newsroom that we're not covering at all with 100. The question is how many people do we have dedicated full-time to beats and communities, so that We don't have the ability to have, a full-time, as we once did. When I started my career at the paper in 1981, we had a separate dance critic, opera critic, classical music critic, an arts writer, a music writer, a TV columnist, multiple TV columnists, movie critic. And so we still cover those things, but we don't cover them all to the same scale. We have to sort of bunch up beats for individual reporters and say, keep an eye on all of these things, and when something bubbles up, go. I mean, I'll just answer your question though specifically. I think the thing that pains me, that I miss the most, particularly in New Orleans, is I wish we had more arts reporters and more. We have some very good cultural critics, cultural reporters, but they're all moving in a lot of different directions, and this is such a rich cultural city. I wish we had more there.
Mindy, what are you not covering?
I would say, so you're right. We've moved from like what Tom Rosenstiel calls the general store.
Yeah.
Right. You had
How many people did you? How big was your newsroom at its peak? Yes.
Well, I wasn't over my newsroom when it was.
No, not yours, but the Miami Herald newsroom.
No, I mean it was considerably larger. It was probably 4 times the size at its peak when we first started. But the reality is that certain types of news is a commodity, and so we've had to make decisions about what do people come to us for, and what are the things that we can offer or offer uniquely. So. National news, we do have McClatchy does have a bureau in D.C., but the way that they even approach that coverage is more to serve, right, the markets in which we have papers. And I think we've had to really look at what we do. So, when I first started at the Miami Herald, we had, bureaus in Beijing and London, and so I can assure you that we have, one guy in Colombia right now. But I still have people covering, the Caribbean, and so there are regions that I know impact Miami, and so that's local news for us, right? So we need to, have reporting that's robust and unique from Latin America and the Caribbean, because it affects us. State coverage is another one. The place that we've suffered, I think, the arts is one where we've definitely suffered, and I also think we've made really conscious decisions to cut out the middle stuff, you're going to go hard after the breaking news, and we're going to do the investigative work, but some of the kind of features that we used to do that really don't seem to either make a difference or have an impact or bring joy or make you laugh, so we stopped doing those. Refrigerator journalism, we used to do a lot of work that it would be the kind of thing that you were proud that your kid's name was in the paper, so you clipped it out and put it on the refrigerator, hence refrigerator journalism. And so we're not doing that anymore, and it's been difficult to negotiate with PR people and other folks who were used to things that they could get in the paper. That now we have to say, we know who reads what, and we know that they're not reading that, and we're not doing it anymore because now we're going to shift our resources here. The thing that keeps me up at night is really local municipal coverage. We've got over 30 different municipalities in Miami-Dade County, and there was a time when I started at the Miami Herald that, we covered every single one of them. And I've tried to create one beat that's kind of like someone who just is like she's going from city to city and finding, quite frankly, a lot of things as a way to make up for that. But that's the biggest difficulty, I think, is the small towns.
Go on.
Well,
When I became managing editor of the LA Times in 2000, I was surprised to see it had a bigger staff than the New York Times at that moment. It was like 12, it was over 1,200. I'm sure it's much smaller.
So when you got there as managing editor, the Los Angeles Times was larger than the New York Times. Today it is less than a third its size. 6 years ago, we were a bigger news staff than the Washington Post. Today we're less than half its size. And while there are plans to build ourselves back up, it will not be to anything close to either of those publications. What I guess surprised me when I got to the Los Angeles Times about 6 months ago, because I had seen those raw numbers, was just the amount of devastation, the amount of loss of talent through attrition, and remarkable changes such as the Orange County edition that Marty Barron ran with 200 people now has
Yeah.
5 in it. What was taken out were a lot of mid-level editors who provide the kind of mentoring and education to new reporters that enabled them to grow and get a whole lot better. I would share your view, though, that if I think about what I'm most concerned about, it is that ability to continue to do public service journalism at a local level. We have, in Los Angeles County, 88 municipalities, 10 million people, and today, 47% of the county is Latino. The total, our ability to develop the kind of coverage to serve new audiences and new populations is really very difficult, not to mention, of course, the kinds of coverage that we used to be able to do, whether it was in Compton or Gardena or in Glendale, and those kinds of things are really lost. We're much more now covering broad issues of interest to the public. So it's environment or immigration or homelessness, but it's not that drilling down into communities. The other thing I think we just have to acknowledge is the importance of being able to do inspirational journalism, and also to recognize that there are other things that our customers look for. To a surprising degree, for some of us, crossword puzzles and recipes play a very important role in the growth of all of our digital publications. And for us, entertainment.
I killed our bridge column and got 5,000
Right.
letters.
We moved our Sunday Sudoku column, and it was amazing. Some of the most important readers we have were complaining about Sudoku. They didn't care about coverage itself. So I think we have to acknowledge that that's an important part of the mix. And in our case, a shift so that, for instance, entertainment has always been important, but food and sports and lifestyle are really something where people look to us in ways that probably give me the most cause for optimism.
I have a million more questions, but I think they will literally yank me off the stage with a cane if I ask them. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you.